Welcome everyone, both in person and virtual. Tonight's presentation is a group effort, and we'd like to take a moment to introduce the three organizations that arranged this event. And at the end of the talk, please come up to our tables to learn more. My name is Jody McDonald, and I am the program chair for the Acton Garden Club. The club has been running for 88 years, but many people in town know us best for our annual plant sale at the Red House each spring. For the sale, our members dig up and donate plants from their own gardens. So the plants are super healthy, and they're also perfectly suited to grow here in this area. We use the proceeds from the plant sale to fund everything else we do. For example, we maintain 3 gardens as well as planters and troughs throughout the town. Our community service includes gardening with young people program, with the schools, and working with patients at Emerson Hospital through our garden therapy program. Our educational talks are open to the public, and they take place right here in room 204 7 times a year. You can find the calendar for these programs on our website. Tonight's presentation is part of our Shirley Towle lecture series. Shirley was a longtime member and a president of the club. She was particularly passionate about the wildflower garden at Meeting House Hill, which the club continues to nurture and maintain. She bequeathed a sum of money to be used to promote a greater interest in gardening and to share experiences that shall be of mutual benefit. Tonight's presentation hopefully will inspire you to get involved. Come up and chat with us after the lecture. One of the things you'll hear about in the talk is milkweed, and I have packets of 3 varieties of milkweed seeds to give away. Next, Joe Cooney will tell you about the Acton Conservation Trust.
Hi, Joe Cooney, Acton Conservation Trust. Can we get just a confirmation online that everything's good?
Sounds much better.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm one of the trustees of the Acton Conservation Trust. Susan Mitchell-Hart, president, is here as well. And we're a nonprofit 501c3 focused on preserving open space in Acton. We work to identify properties, counsel landowners on their options, work to get properties acquired, get conservation restrictions on them, monitor those conservation restrictions, and that happens in perpetuity once we get a conservation restriction on. So it's a key part of our work. We work within a land preservation ecosystem where we work with lots of partners, whether it's town committees, the select board, Sudbury Valley trustees, the CPA and the CPC, the Community Preservation Act funds, and the Community Preservation Committee to fund a lot of projects that the town buys and where ACT holds the conservation restriction. And some recent examples include the agricultural preservation restriction at Stonefield Farm, the Piper Lane extension to Great Hill Conservation Area, the Grassy Pond West expansion to Grassy Pond Conservation Area. And I'd like to also acknowledge Acton Garden Club member and strong ACT supporter Nancy Kingman, who passed away in January. She and her husband Bill were the first Actonians to donate a perpetual conservation restriction to ACT on their 6-acre horse pasture farm on Esterbrook Road. And for those who can see the slide, it's the on the other slide, it was the bottom picture there. That's the Kingman's pasture. So now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in addition to our land preservation projects, we build awareness around conservation matters for our members and others in Acton through speaking events and various nature walks. Examples include a winter tracking walk, a spring woodcock prowl, and a fall mushroom forage. We're proud to partner with the Acton Garden Club and Energize Acton to bring you this talk with Anna. This is actually the 3rd in a series of speakers that ACT has sponsored supporting native plants, pollinators, and biodiversity, including Ken Warchol about the role of honeybees in our environment, and Claudia Thompson, founder of Grow Nature Massachusetts, about new conservation strategies for the 21st century. Thank you all for attending here in the room and online. And handing it to
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Karen Root with energizeacton.org. All of us here tonight care and participating in this talk care about the natural environment. And I imagine many of us think about climate change. When I retired from teaching, if you could click forward, there's a little delay on it, there we go. I asked myself what I could do to celebrate the wonder that the children taught me and to ensure a livable future for them. That question led me on the path to energizeacton.org. How we use energy matters for the natural world. Our role in the carbon cycle really matters. EnergizeActon.org is meant to be a resource helping households and businesses reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon output. Alongside information, the website helps us plan for a renewable energy future and helps us track our progress toward these goals in our own households and as a community. And there should be a button showing up momentarily that, can you click? Anyhow, the website shows you how much progress you've made and how far you still have to go, if you can click again. The heart of the website, yeah, there are the buttons there. The heart of the website is the actions page, part of which is seen here. Some actions are big ticket items that take planning, like purchasing an electric vehicle or moving to cold weather heat pumps as our oil and gas furnaces age out. There are great new incentives at the state and federal level to tackle these big actions. Other actions are quicker to implement, like eating more plant-based foods and composting our kitchen scraps. And if you could click, there are two actions that should come up on the right. The first is calculating your carbon footprint, which is super easy to do. It's free and very informative. The second action is gardening ecologically, which is why we're here tonight, and keeping that carbon in our soils and in our plants. We invite you all to explore this action and the whole website. Join us as a member and track your own goals and find out about future events that we hold. And perhaps after Anna's inspiration, there are some local folks who are listening to this talk who would like to brainstorm about doing more as gardeners, perhaps creating pollinator pathways like nearby Lincoln, Massachusetts. And we can all go to the Wild Seed Project website and get seeds that are winter sow seeds that we can start to use in our landscape right now and enjoy next year. And speaking of the Wild Seed Project, it's my privilege to extend a huge welcome to Anna Fialkoff, who is their ecological programs manager. Anna also worked for over 6 years with the Native Plant Trust at Garden in the Woods in nearby Framingham, Massachusetts, as their senior horticulturalist. She even did programming in our own Acton Arboretum. Anna's wonderful and incredibly helpful talks range from creating gardens for wildlife, to rewilding, to thinking like a forest. When I think of Anna, I partly think of her as a tree whisperer, but I realize really she's a gardener whisperer, and I'm tremendously thankful for that. Welcome, Anna.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone on Zoom hear me? Wonderful. Okay, and feel free to just type in to the chat box. I think we'll end up having lots of Q&A towards the end. Thank you everyone so much for joining me, and I'm really happy to have the support of the partner organizations that have co-sponsored this talk. We have Energize Acton, the Acton Conservation Trust, and excuse me, there's a little feedback, so it's going to take me a moment to adjust to that. Garden Club of Acton. I'm so excited to bring you this talk tonight. Thank you very much for adjusting that. And I'm the Ecological Programs Manager for Wild Seed Project. I just wanted to introduce myself and introduce Wild Seed Project for those of you who have not heard of us before. So who here in the room, in the live room, has heard of Wild Seed Project before hearing about this talk? Oh, awesome. Actually, the majority of the room, that's really great to hear. And I believe, and how about on those of you on Zoom? Do you want to just type into the chat box? I can actually see some of your questions and answers. A bunch of people, okay. And who here has heard of some of the other organizations that have presented a little bit tonight? Energize Acton, Acton Conservation Trust, and the Acton Garden Club? Okay. But if you're a little less familiar with what we do at Wild Seed Project, our mission is really to build awareness around the vital importance of native plants and inspire community action to plant native species in our parks, in our backyards, front yards, in our public spaces, and even our commercial spaces as well, so that we can build biodiversity where we live, have birds and pollinators come back, and also increase the resilience of our landscapes overall. So at Wild Seed Project, we might have heard we do sell seeds of native plants, and they're plants that you can sow the seeds of actually in the winter time, which is very different from what you would normally do with vegetable or herb species, those tender annuals and perennials that you grow starting in the spring under maybe a green light. With our native plants, you actually sow them outside in the fall, and you can do it in pots or a prepared garden bed. And they actually go through this winter cold, moist stratification period, which allows the seeds to kind of break through their hard seed coat that's covering them and protecting them and sprout and germinate come spring. So at Wild Seed Project, we educate people about wild seeds and all about gardening with native plants. I want to talk to you about gardening in general today, gardening as if the earth matters, which is, I think, a really great title that Karen coined. I often call this talk Gardening for Habitat, which is pretty much the same thing, just thinking about our gardens as places where people can take part in nature and not just have something aesthetically beautiful to look at, not just beautiful showy flowers, but have something that it actually fosters life and resilience in our landscapes. So before we actually get started, at Wild Seed Project, we are committed to acknowledging the landscape that we work on before every program that we teach. We've carefully crafted this, so I'm going to read this now. We'd like to recognize that I am leading this program from Wild Seed Project that actually works in the state of Maine from unceded Wabanaki territory. And we recognize the inherent sovereignty of the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the people of the Don, the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy, and honor their relationship to the plants, animals, and other beings that have been threatened and displaced through settler colonialism. The work that we do at Wild Seed Project is necessary precisely because of the ongoing impacts of colonization, including centuries of industrialization, urbanization, and commodification. Bringing native plants back to our landscapes is one significant action we can take to decolonize our practices, our priorities, and our perspectives. We also encourage you to learn more about the land that you live on and explore nativelands.ca. And join us in supporting Indigenous-led efforts to protect the land, water, plants, and creatures among us. Now, if you're unfamiliar with nativelands.ca, It's a website that actually shows you can search your region, and it takes away the political boundaries of our states and cities, and actually replaces those boundaries with the historical and current tribal territories of the region. So you can see some of these tribal territories that are part of Maine and Canada, and the Wabanaki is basically based in Maine. Now, moving on to thinking about native plants. What are native plants anyway? I think many of us share some of the understanding of what native plants are, but oftentimes our definitions of what native means can overlap or can kind of be in conflict with each other. Native plants, I think, in my mind, it's not as important to know about, why native plants are called native plants, but really to think about the fact that they're supporting local food webs. And if you consider it from that perspective, then you're not necessarily, thinking just about kind of not wanting to plant all the exotic species and planting only native species. We don't have to come from kind of a purist perspective like that, but just to support more local food webs by including plants in our landscapes that have had long coevolutionary relationships with the insects and the animals and the other wildlife that have been in this particular region for thousands of years. Now, some people define native plants as native to maybe a particular region, meaning before pre-European colonization, these plants existed. And that is important if you think about the previous slide and what we had just talked about, thinking about the Native American peoples that used to store this land. When Europeans colonized the land in North America, we saw a huge influx of new species that have ever since started to naturalize here. Oftentimes, most of the species we look at around us are not actually native to this region. And many of them have become invasive and are causing all sorts of harm in our environments, not necessarily caused by the individual species, but caused by the conditions that we promoted them within. So I definitely encourage folks to read more about native plants and why they're important for all the different species that rely on them as the basis of our local food webs by reading books by Doug Towle. He's a researcher and entomologist at the University of Delaware, and one of his most recent books is Nature's Best Hope. Many of us who are interested in native plants now have come to the world of native plants by reading Bringing Nature Home, one of his first really keystone books that really hit home for a lot of people. Nature's Best Hope gives a little bit more how to make this happen. And we've, for a Wild Sea Project, have really taken off from a lot of his research and teachings in order to give people actionable steps that they can take to plant native species and encourage biodiversity where they live. Now we can start by shrinking our lawn. There's a little bit of feedback here. I think somebody's phone might be on in the audience. There we go. Okay, thank you. We can start by shrinking our lawn. Doug Towle actually encourages folks to shrink their lawns in half. And it doesn't mean that you have to take away your lawn altogether. It just means that, lawn doesn't have to be the default in our landscape. Since lawns are actually quite damaging to our environment, they require lots of inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, heavy irrigation. They're one of the most irrigated crops in the US. And a lot of those inputs actually drain out and go into water bodies, or run off and go into water bodies and end up polluting them. Also the mowing and the fossil fuels that mowers are reliant on. I know we're moving more and more to electric mowers, which is a great step, but even that is unnecessary to have so much of in our landscapes. I think we can kind of reduce our lawns and think about, you know, where do we actually need lawn in our landscapes? I think lawns are great for those spaces that we gather. You can kind of think of them as creating outdoor rooms in your landscape. I really like, I've heard before that lawns we can think of as, instead of the wall-to-wall carpet, we can kind of take them as the aerial rug. So they take up a portion of our landscapes, but just not all of it. We can also use lawns as places to ways to convey us through the landscape, because lawns are places that, you know, we can walk on. They handle a lot of foot traffic. They're good for recreation, playing soccer, but not necessarily for every, you know, front yard and every park that we have. We can do a lot better than that. And instead of lawn, we can add layers of native plants. You can see in these photos that there is a really beautiful kind of lawn outdoor room and pathway indicated here by just the mowed edge, and the native plants that are growing up or left to grow around the lawn are really framing the lawn space. And you have a variety of different structural pieces here. You have trees and you have meadow plants, you have some shrubs and other ground covers that really take up that space. And then the negative space is the lawn. So I like to say, why mow it when you can meadow? Mowing is pretty boring, but growing beautiful native plants that attract bees and butterflies and hummingbirds and other species of songbirds are going to be a lot more interesting than spending your Saturdays on the lawnmower. In this photo, you can see that the beautiful native plants that are in here, a mix of purples and yellows. It's the New York ironweed and the Joe Pye weed and a little bit of autumn sneezeweed in here. Doesn't actually make you sneeze, but it's just called that. And these species are all blooming in the late summer all together. So it's a really gorgeous scene, and you can have this kind of magical landscape in your backyard. But in order to kind of get something like this, there's different approaches you can take. I don't think that you need to always just stop mowing and let the lawn grow up, because what comes in the place of lawn can sometimes be worse weeds like invasive species if they're nearby, a lot of European grasses and other non-native weeds that end up kind of taking over. But depending on where you live and what's around you, what the weed bank looks like in the soil, you can have sometimes some native asters and goldenrods and coneflowers, that those really good, vigorous native plants that can take up space can kind of fill those voids and help compete against those European grasses. And you can also intentionally plant species into what used to be lawn in order to get more diversity in there. One way that I like to do that is by doing something called sheet mulching. So I'll put down a nice layer of cardboard over a tightly mowed lawn, and then a good 2 to 4 inches of aged leaf mold or bark mulch, so that it has plenty of organic matter and substance over the ground, that it will shade out the ground and smother the grass and the weeds below, and then add lots of organic matter to the soil as it breaks down over several months. If you put that down in the spring, you can actually plant into that in the fall. And then if you put that sheet mulching down in the fall, you can plant into it in the spring. You do need to allow it a good several months to break down and become real soil. And when you plant, you can put down things in sunny spots. You can put things down like this native cover crop, which is also a pollinator powerhouse. It's called partridge pea. And I used this when I was a horticulturist at Garden in the Woods. I got the chance to design a native meadow, and we laid down lots of native grass seeds, as well as the partridge pea. But the grass and the other long-lived perennials are much slower to get established. So to help them get established, this native cover crop will grow, in a in the first year, it'll actually start flowering prolifically. It's an annual. So annuals tend to grow really fast and they flower a lot and then they put out a lot of seeds. That's their kind of reproductive strategy since they're not going to be coming back year after year. And in any bare spots in the soil, that's where it'll reseed and you'll see it coming back next year. So this helps shade the ground, and it's in the pea family, so it fixes nitrogen in the soil and really gets the soil prepared and ready for those longer lived crops to come up. And meanwhile, underneath, the grasses, the bunching grasses and the longer lived perennials are growing slowly in the nice shade that they get from the partridge pea. They're not drying out as quickly. And that partridge pea, in the meantime, serves as this incredible pollinator powerhouse. It attracts bees and wasps and beetles and butterflies and moths, all to its flowers, which contain lots of pollen but no nectar. They're beautiful yellow flowers with red centers. And then the base of the petiole of the leaf, between the leaf and the main stem, there's this tiny little gland that looks like a miniature cup, and it holds a little bit of this resin or this sugary substance, a nectar that attracts other pollinators and other beneficial insects like ants and other species that will actually protect the plants from herbivory and kind of form a nice relationship with the plant, creating kind of a little miniature food web within the greater food web of the larger landscape. There's actually been studies that showed that partridge pea could be used as a potential trap crop next to crops like corn, where it brings in so many beneficial insects that maybe some of those are predators of things like the European corn borer and other species that would actually be pests on corn. So this pollinator powerhouse, partridge pea, is one of my favorite species for bringing in a lot of really beneficial insects and pollinators. But we do need to kind of think beyond pollinators. So I encourage everyone to think about the landscape as a whole, as that three-dimensional structure, not just having the beautiful showy flowers in the landscape that are sun-loving, that bring in the typical pollinator plants that we associate, but to think about the trees, the shrubs, the canopy trees, the small flowering trees, the shrubs, the ground cover layer, and even vines that can take up vertical space and can pair together to add more surface area for native plant biomass and more opportunities for insects and wildlife to have things to eat, the leaves that they eat, the flowers that they pollinate and get nectar from, and the fruits as well. And you can do this even in a small landscape like this. It can look beautiful to be wild and unmanaged looking, but you can frame the landscape with these native plants, maybe use brick instead of lawn sometimes, and use container plants in small spaces where you can't fit larger, shrubs or perennials otherwise. So in the layering system, you want to start with planting actually the native trees. And there's certain species of native trees that are the most supportive of life. So actually our oaks are the top trees that are supportive of life in our landscapes. Doug Towle, actually, his latest book is called The Nature of Oaks, because oaks in themselves are one of our major keystone species, as he calls them. They support hundreds and hundreds of species of moth and butterfly caterpillars, which feed on their leaves. And actually, depending on where you live, they might support 400 to 500 plus species. Now, the willows, the cherries, the birches, and the poplars are also all considered our top native keystone tree groups. Some of these you can actually get shrubs of, or larger trees or small trees, so you don't have to think about always planting a large canopy tree to have this. But something like a black cherry will host all different kinds of species, over 300 to 400 species of caterpillars of moths and butterflies. And just to give you a nice example of one of the beautiful species it supports, there's the Cecropia moth, which uses black cherry as one of its main host plants. So as its larval host, The Cecropia moth will lay its eggs on the leaves of black cherry and just a few other species after it closes, hatches from its cocoon, and mates in the spring, in the late spring sometime. Then these caterpillars crawl out and start munching on the leaves, and they can get to be really beautiful, kind of interesting looking caterpillars. The Cecropia caterpillars in particular are, you know, these kind of large, chunky caterpillars with little spikes and balls of red and yellow and blue on the ends of these spikes. They're really wild looking. And I think a lot of the adaptations that caterpillars have that make them look really beautiful to us or really interesting are what kind of repels birds from wanting to eat them. I think they're trying to look unpalatable. But in essence, they really are bird food. In fact, songbirds feed their young on a diet mostly of protein-rich caterpillars. So that's why thinking about the caterpillars of moths and butterflies is so important, and supporting them is so important, because birds are really the bellwether of ecological health and resiliency in our landscapes. And recently we've seen major drops in populations of birds and insects, and those are very strongly correlated. Birds eat mainly insects throughout the growing season, and then in the winter they often will subsist on more berries and seeds and things like that. But they really need those protein-rich insects, especially to feed their young. So when the Cecropia moth actually goes to pupate and form into a cocoon, it actually spends its whole time in a cocoon for about several months of winter. It actually overwinters by spinning its cocoon on the branch of a tree and hanging there, and then comes out the next spring. So what's interesting about this is that the Cecropia is a little bit protected in the tree canopy this way, but there are other beautiful moth species like the Luna moth you might have heard of. So beach plum is a really great plant for pollinators because it has those early spring flowers, and then of course the pollinators, the moths and the butterfly caterpillars, they need them for that middle part of their life cycle when they're eating leaves. And then also it's really supportive of a wide range of different wildlife that loves the plums. Even people can partake in the juicy fruit of these plums. They look like commercial plums, but they're just smaller. They're about the size of maybe a large cherry, maybe a little bit bigger. And they have a stone pit, just like regular plums. Asters and goldenrods are another kind of keystone group of plants. Lots of plants in the aster family are actually supportive of hundreds of species of moth and butterfly caterpillars. And what's more about aster and goldenrods is that they provide this really vital late season forage for bees and wasps and all sorts of animals in that family. Because they are blooming so late in the season, there's really an aster and a goldenrod for every single garden situation, and every garden situation really deserves an aster and a goldenrod. There's so many different species, and they're so supportive of life. So the flax-leaved aster is just one example of an aster that's really garden friendly. It grows in really tough, sandy soils, just like the beach plum, and I think would work really well at the feet of the beach plum. And it's nice and upright, very floriferous, and even has amazing fall color. The zigzag goldenrod is great for shade, moist shade, so kind of opposite conditions of the flax-leaved aster. And it's a very garden-worthy goldenrod. I think a lot of goldenrods get a bad reputation from just a few species of goldenrods, like the Canada goldenrod and the wrinkle-leaf goldenrod, which grow on roadsides and in large open fields and are great for those kinds of settings, but just don't work for a smaller garden. So there's actually lots of options for sun and shade for more garden-worthy goldenrods and asters. Also, unfortunately, goldenrods get a bad reputation as causing seasonal allergies or hay fever at the end of summer and early fall. And actually, the culprit is ragweed, which is a plant that has windborne pollen, so it's going to float in the air and cause a lot more disturbance to our nasal passages than goldenrod would, which is animal pollinated. It has this sticky, heavy pollen that is meant to stick to the bodies of animals and be transported that way. So it's actually a myth that goldenrod causes allergies. So one more great reason to love goldenrods. You can take an approach as well as, thinking about the plants that support the most life as also narrowing in and targeting some of your favorite pollinators like hummingbirds. So you can grow vertical with vines and reach, up into your, the top corners of your house or on an arbor and have more places to grow native plants like that. By having something like the trumpet honeysuckle, which is great for hummingbirds. It has these long-lasting, beautiful coral colored flowers that are just really wonderful for hummingbirds. This is a trumpet honeysuckle that's growing actually outside of the horticulture building at Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Massachusetts. If you ever get a chance to go to Garden in the Woods, I suggest it because there's a lot of inspiration you can get from all the native plants they have in a variety of situations. But this one, we would constantly watch the hummingbirds darting in and out of this bush, and then other bird species like the phoebe actually would nest in this bush. The cardinal flower and the scarlet bee balm are other examples of great hummingbird nectar. To support hummingbirds, you do want to make sure that you're providing them nectar at all different times during the growing season. So you don't want to just have one plant that attracts hummingbirds. You want to have a spring blooming plant and a midsummer blooming plant and have that overlap with late summer and fall blooming plants as well, because they need things late into the season as they start to migrate as well. So all this to say, we've talked a lot about all the different plants that you can grow in your yard, and there's so many more. I could talk about plants forever, honestly. But when you're going to pick out and buy your plants, I think that is the trickiest part for a lot of us, is where do we actually buy these native plants that are not grown with pesticides, and if possible are grown from seed. So buying pesticide-free plants is so important just because of all the things we talked about how these pollinators, these caterpillars of moths and butterflies and other insects are feeding on these plants, the leaves and the flowers. And if they're grown with pesticides, these systemic pesticides called neonicotinoids, which actually infiltrate the whole vascular system of the plant and can last in there for more than 1 year, then we're going to be giving these pollinators contaminated food. And just like we don't want to ingest contaminated food, we don't want our pollinators to be either. So really it's up to the consumer at this point to reach out to our local nurseries and ask for our request and demand actually pesticide-free plants. Just like with the organic food movement, we have to make it kind of a consumer demand. So if you want to learn more about this, I think you can visit the Wild Seed Project website. We have a whole blog post about navigating the nurseries, and then we also have a great resource for various nurseries that you can find by state. Right here, very locally in Massachusetts, you can find lots of amazing seed-grown native plants that are grown without pesticides at Garden in the Woods. So what we plant, I think, is just as important as how we manage our landscapes. And I want to give an example about how to think about how we're managing our landscapes by showing you the life cycle of another pollinator species. So the butterfly, the checker spot butterfly, the Baltimore checker spot to be specific, is a butterfly that relies on just a few host plants itself. One of the main host plants is the white turtlehead, and it will lay its eggs on the white turtlehead leaves, and they will hatch in early spring. They'll have this protective webbing around them, and they're usually in a group. They're gregarious, so they kind of travel together within this protective webbing. They launch this webbing from one leaf to the next, or one branch to the next once they've eaten all the leaves on one branch. And it's really fun to see them kind of march across this little web string, kind of like a spider's web. I've witnessed it. When they finish, eating for the season, they actually are not ready to pupate yet. They take 2 growing seasons to complete their life cycle. So the first season, after they're finished in the fall, they'll crawl down into the leaf litter at the base of a plant that they've just been eating, and they'll actually overwinter in the leaf litter as these even more vulnerable caterpillars, not even in their cocoons, but as these little caterpillars still. The next season, they crawl up their host plants and keep on munching and eating until they've saved up enough resources to pupate come midsummer. And then they pupate into this really beautiful chrysalis and emerge and actually become a pollinator in our landscape, requiring the nectar and pollen of multiple different flower species beyond their host plant. So you can see that to support a Baltimore checker spot butterfly, if you want to target that, for instance, you do need to not only plant its host plants, you have to plant lots of different flowering plants, and then also not blow the leaves away that they live in throughout the winter. So I encourage everyone to take steps to leave your leaves. Leave them as they fall to the ground. Our oak leaves and our other canopy tree leaves are really vital resources in our landscape. They sustain birds by protecting these insects that the birds eat throughout the winter. They protect overwintering creatures, and not just the butterflies and moths, but things like bumblebees, which actually overwinter under the leaf litter. Different species of frogs will hibernate under the leaf litter, and salamanders, and a wide range of different species. The leaves break down over time and add organic material to the soil, which builds living soil. Within the leaf litter, if you go into a mature forest, you can lift up that leaf litter where it starts to turn to soil, and you'll see all these threads of white threads running throughout. Sometimes it'll look a little bit grayish. And what that really is the mycorrhizal threads, which are oftentimes like the roots or the most of the organism of a mushroom. What comes out when you get a fruit of a mushroom is its reproductive part. That's what you see above the leaves. And that's just indicative of a very, life-giving soil. So the leaves also are really important these days for insulating our plant roots. So they need this in order to not freeze and thaw and kind of heave up over the winter. And with climate change, we're having fewer and fewer snows that are actually long lasting. A lot of times they melt away as soon as they fall. And so we actually need a good thick layer of leaves to insulate those roots and protect those creatures. So we can take steps to kind of reconsider our yard cleanup. I think some of us might be intimidated by the idea of leaving all our leaves because it doesn't seem like there's enough places to accommodate all the leaves that fall. And what can happen is that, we feel like we're just overburdened with leaves. We're thinking about trees as the problem. Trees are dropping so many leaves, they're dropping so many fruits. They're nuisances in the landscape. But I really encourage you all to kind of flip that idea. And when you are valuing trees in the landscape, you're considering them and all their ecosystem services. Trees are soaking up stormwater, they're shading and cooling the ground, especially in our cities and suburbs where we have more and more hardscape and the urban heat island effect. And they're providing all these other different wildlife value traits. So they're encouraging caterpillars and birds and other insects to thrive in them, squirrels and other small mammals. So if we actually are valuing trees in our landscapes, then we'll help them kind of thrive by allowing places for those leaves to fall. So we can think about getting rid of areas of lawn and replacing them with growing spaces. They don't have to be manicured gardens. They can be kind of low impact, low maintenance native plantings of, say, ground covers or some shrubs underneath the trees. And then you have more places to accommodate the leaves, more space for the leaves to go. And still, I think many of us still will have more leaves than we can accommodate for a variety of reasons. So I encourage you to read the blog post on our website called Leave the Leaves, because it goes into a lot more detail than I'm probably going to be able to go into in this talk. But leaving those leaves underneath trees especially provide those soft landings for pollinators when they drop down from the canopy to overwinter. So especially under trees, you can replace what was once lawn and these sidewalk health strip plantings into a garden planting or a native planting that's low maintenance of ground covers, et cetera, and let those leaves fall where they stay where they fall. If you have too many leaves, you can kind of pile them up and make a compost out of them. And if you just separate that from your vegetable compost, you don't necessarily want to put them together because you can use those composted leaves as mulch on your garden beds later. One fun way to do this is at Garden in the Woods, we made these leaf column fences with either chicken wire or hardware cloth, something to contain the leaves. We would coil them up and stack them next to each other. And then you just pile all the leaves into it. And you'd be surprised at how many leaves you need to fill them, because they're going to continue to break down throughout the year. And you'll be needing to fill them up. And before you know it, you'll have not enough leaves to make these full. And you'll be looking for leaves in your neighbors' yards and finding more and more leaves, because leaves are going to start to be a real resource to you when you start to understand the value that they have. One thing that you can do, you can let them pile up and you can make a living fence out of it even. The bottom layer you can see in this fence is starting to turn to compost or soil, and plants will start to seed into this area. Some asters. In this photo, it's wood poppy. You can see the experimentation that was done at the Garden in the Woods family activity area here. They tried different things like wood cookies in some of those fence sections and other types of materials to see what would work well. And it's not just the leaves that you need to leave. You need to leave things that fall from the trees as well. You need to leave sticks and fallen logs in place as much as possible. I mean, you can rearrange things, but I think leaving those things is going to encourage more life to grow. It might be an edible chicken of the woods mushroom, or it could be a beautiful mossy log that develops if it falls in a very moist place like a small pond. You can get creative with those fallen logs and rearrange them, put them together. At Garden in the Woods, there was a sculpture created by Gary Smith, who's a landscape designer for a lot of different native gardens around the US. And in just an afternoon with some volunteers, he did a little sketch in this little dell at Garden in the Woods. And they moved all the logs into this beautiful sinuous shape that he sketched out. And all the fallen logs look like they have a purpose. They're cohesive, they're beautiful, they kind of pull the eye to the contours of the landscape. And when you lift one of those logs up, as you do in any kind of nature walk with children, you're always going to lift a log up and find salamanders underneath, centipedes, all sorts of things that are living in there. Those places will also be conducive to more bird food, because all the insects that are living in there are going to be food for birds that don't migrate over the winter. You can do other things like stack your stick piles into fun shapes, and even make woven fences with your prunings. And you can go beyond leaving the leaves, leaving the sticks, leaving the standing vegetation. The less you do, really, the better in your landscape. You can leave things especially that have structure and maybe seed heads for food for birds over the winter. And that also often provides a lot of forage and cover for other species of wildlife. If you leave stems of plants that are pithy or hollow, that's going to be the majority of your meadow plants or sun-loving plants, like Joe Pye weeds and asters and goldenrods and ironweeds and things like that, but also some semi-woody plants like elderberry and flowering raspberry, for example. A lot of these stems have hollow chambers or pithy chambers in them, which create perfect, ideal nesting habitat and hibernation habitat for native bees. We're used to seeing lots about honeybees, actually, the decline of honeybees, but our native bees are in decline as well, and they need more opportunities to nest and forage. And allowing those stems to stay up over the winter is going to allow the adult bees to hibernate. And if you keep these stems up for more than 1 year, they're going to be allowed to kind of dry out and not be disease-infested sticks that can actually be more conducive for when the bees go to lay their eggs in them. So a lot of our native bees, we have, I think in Maine, about 270 species of native bees, but in Massachusetts, I think there's even more. A lot of them are solitary species that don't colonize and form nests or hives. They'll lay their eggs, sometimes up to about 30 groups of eggs within one stem. So if you leave your stems up at least to about 18 inches, 12 inches to 18 inches, you can cut them back, but leave them up at least that high, then you're gonna have enough length of stem for the bees to lay their eggs into. And also there's ground nesting bees, and there's bees that nest in snags and dead trees in the woods too. So there's other places that bees nest. If you have some sandy or gravelly soil, you're likely going to have some bare patches because it tends to be a little drier. And that's good. You do want to leave the leaves where they do fall, but bare patches are okay, and those are great for the ground nesting bees and wasps. I particularly love the great black wasp. It's also called the black digger wasp, which actually is a pollinator of a lot of the bee balms, like this spotted bee balm here, and has this blue iridescence when it flies. This is actually going to be really happy in a coastal sandplain environment or a very sandy soil where there might be plants like spotted bee balm or New England blazing star, or even prickly pear cactus as shown here in this picture. And overall, we want to create opportunities in our landscapes and decrease harm. So we can do that with those gardening practices. We can do that with what we plant and how we design our plantings. But we can also do some less gardening things to add opportunities in our landscape for pollinators and insects and birds and other wildlife. So we can add window well covers. That's a simple, easy step we can take, low-hanging fruit, to our basement windows, those windows that are partially submerged in the ground. That not only keeps water out of the basement, but it also keeps small creatures from crawling in and not being able to get out. You'd be surprised at how many species die every year by falling into those window wells. You can also install things like low or motion censored lights that are kind of not pointing up towards the sky, but pointing towards the ground. And having no lights is better than having lights in general, even though we want to have lots of lights around festive holidays like Halloween and the holidays that we have coming up in December. We still want to, most of the year, keep lights at a minimum. And that not only decreases light pollution for ourselves, but also minimizes the disturbance of crucial pollinators like moths, which often fly at night and are following the scent path of their mate to reproduce in the wee hours of the morning. If they get interrupted by, being attracted to a light, they may never find their mate and reproduce. Other things like water features, any sort of water feature is great for migrating birds in the fall and the spring. And if it bubbles, then the birds are going to be able to hear that if it runs or bubbles. I really like this water feature in this photo because It's actually kind of just it's also a way to manage stormwater. It funnels water from the roof into a satellite dish, which creates a little pool and a little place for gurgling water. That feeds into another kind of runoff that goes into a small retaining pond. And then beyond what you can see, it goes into yet another pond. So there's running water everywhere. If there's also native plants in your yard, when birds are coming through to migrate and need to drink water, they'll also find things to eat if they come through and see the native plants there too. And nesting boxes, bird boxes and bat boxes. You have wood duck boxes and bluebird boxes, all sorts of different kinds of nesting boxes to just add more opportunities for habitat. I do caution people maybe a little bit against the bee boxes or the bee hotels. Those are great educational tools, but you do want to be careful and kind of replace those materials each year if you are going to use them, because you don't want them to start to grow funguses or have diseases that kind of get started if they get wet and are there out year after year. So overall, I think doing these practices in our neighborhoods, working together to create a movement and adding more opportunities for pollinators just in our backyards or in our public spaces are going to create over time these pollinator corridors and other wildlife corridors. So for instance, if we plant milkweed in our yards, we're going to attract the monarch butterfly caterpillars. They're going to be eating those milkweeds, but we also need a variety of other wildflowers for the monarch to eat during their fall migration. So we need milkweeds, but we need more than milkweeds, and we need pollinators, but we need more than pollinators. We need all the other wildlife that creates those local food webs. And we need more of us to be doing this. We need more people to be planting. So I encourage you all to spread the word. Let other people know what you're up to. Maybe you can put a yard sign out in your yard where you're doing something a little different, where you're stopping mowing, where you're adding a native ground cover, have just planted a native tree, to show people that you're doing something a little extra special here and that it's really good to find out about it. This is a great way to approach people without being confrontational. I think a lot of us are really passionate about this, about bringing biodiversity back into our landscapes and being environmental stewards, but we can't always go and tell our across the street neighbors, to stop using fertilizers and pesticides on their lawn without a little pushback or creating enemies. So instead of that, I think it's good to do this, to lead by example a lot of the time. And there will be passersby if you have a sidewalk that may gain some interest and may go visit a website that will give them more information. And you can get lots of yard signs, both from our website and from places like Prairie Moon Nursery. I really like their yard signs, and other native plant organizations that are starting to kind of catch on. I see a lot of Leave the Leaves signs out there as well these days. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm gonna just leave it on this kind of resource slide here, and I'd be happy to send a PDF to the participants who registered so that you can get all the resources from this handout. And I'll be open for questions now. Oh yeah. Thank you. Should I call on people in the audience? Great. I'll start here in the room, and then we'll have a little time for questions from the Zoom.
Yeah, there's plenty of those.
Okay, great. I see somebody in the front row just raised their hand first.
You talked about white turtle head, but I know it comes in different colors. Why did you just zero in on the white?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question since I think the Zoomers weren't able to hear it. So there's white turtle head, but there's also other colors of turtle head. So you're wondering what other kinds of turtle head are there, and are they supportive of the Baltimore checker spot as well? So turtle heads, there's a couple different species of turtle heads. The one that's native to New England and the Northeast is called white turtle head, Chelone glabra, but there is another species that has a pink flower, and you might know about that. That's Chelone leone, and oftentimes it comes in different cultivar varieties. So I think that the white turtlehead is the main host plant for the checker spot, at least in their first year. In their second year, their palate opens up and they eat more things. Just like as kids get older, they start eating a little bit more. So I think in the second year for the Baltimore checker spot, they will eat the pink turtlehead too. And it probably depends on where you live because different species take up different regions. So I think that planting both is great. If you really like those pink flowers from the pink turtlehead, plant those, but maybe also, if you have the space, also plant the white turtlehead. So it's a good idea, especially if there's cultivated varieties. Those have varying degrees of wildlife value. There's folks like Heather Holm from the University of Vermont and Mount Cuba Center in Delaware that are doing studies on the cultivated varieties of native plants and whether their wildlife value is as good or the same or not as good as the natural species. And they are finding with a lot of the cultivars that the wildlife value has declined with the cultivar. And that's, I think, a lot of times because of the different traits that cultivars are bred for. So that might be, having larger flowers or double flowers, often, and the double flowers where there's no reproductive parts left, it's just all petals, those actually don't produce any nectar or pollen. So they're not great for pollinators at all. But even the change in color of a leaf in one cultivar to another can sometimes throw off pollinators, make them not like the taste of the leaf. Sometimes the nectar content is shifted from a native plant to a cultivar. So there's a lot to consider. I would just say have a good reason for planting a cultivar. If you want a dwarf plant, like a dwarf variety of a sweet pepper bush because you have a very small yard, that makes sense to me. But overall, try to plant more of the natural species. Or if you do have a cultivar in your yard and you do have the space, also plant the natural species alongside it, or maybe in the more natural areas of the garden. Yes, in the back.
I have a question. If you see bees and other insects attracted to flowers, can you assume those flowers are offering them something? I have an enormous hydrangea bush. I read that hydrangeas offer nothing, but every fall there are thousands of bees all over my hydrangeas.
Really great question. So the question is, if you see bees or other pollinators attracted to a plant and their flowers, does that automatically mean that that is a really good pollinator plant? Is that right? Did I get that right? Hydrangeas, for instance, different species. There's some native species and non-native species, and I know both will attract pollinators. I think it's a little nuanced. So a lot of times with the native species, there's going to be more specialist species, so species of plants that have very closely evolved relationships with particular pollinators, but that's not always the case. There's mint family plants that are native, like the mountain mints and the bee balms that attract tons of bee species, but so do non-native mints. Those tend to be more generalist species because they attract a wide range of different types of bee species. There's also, very, very specialized plants like gentian, which attracts only bumblebees because bumblebees are the strongest pollinator that can actually pry open the closed petals and get at the nectar of those plants. It's really fun to watch gentian be pollinated. You see the bee completely disappear into the flower and the little legs sticking out. So I like to say, we can really try to target those specialist species and plant a wide range of different native species, and then the pollinators will follow. You're going to attract more life by planting those specialist species and then just a diversity of plants than necessarily planting all generalist species. But, it doesn't mean that non-native plants are not good for pollinators at all. They're just not going to have those really specialized relationships with certain pollinators that we really are potentially losing in our system right now. And I think also just really considering all the other life cycle components of our pollinators is important. So not just planting pollinator flowers, but planting the trees and the shrubs and other plants that those pollinators eat when they're in their larval stages as caterpillars. It's really important for making sure that we're bringing their whole life cycle full circle. And another question over here.
Hummingbirds, like other plants other than bee balm, why did you mention red as particular for hummingbirds? Do they like the color red?
Oh yeah, so the question is, do hummingbirds like particular plants like bee balm, and why did I mention the color red as for hummingbirds? Yeah, so hummingbirds actually like a lot of different flower colors, but they tend to be most attracted to reds and oranges, sometimes yellows, just because those are what they see first. But I see hummingbirds drinking from the bee balm, that kind of lavender colored wild bergamot bee balm. That's the Monarda fistulosa, and all sorts of other plants too. So I think what is kind of special for hummingbirds is they really need nectar. And so very high nectar containing flowers, often that have tubular flowers, those are the types of flowers that their long bills can reach into. So sometimes they specialize on those plants because a lot of other pollinators can't get to the nectar within those flowers. So should we go to some questions from Zoom? That sounds great.
I guess one of the first questions people ask was where to get the seeds, but I think you did kind of address that, but maybe if you could just give another run through of, resources for where to get seeds that are for native plants.
Yeah. So where to get seeds for native plants? Well, Wild Seed Project actually is one of the only seed sellers in New England of native plants. We don't sell large quantities of seeds, so we sell small packets, and some of you who are here in the room see some of the packets on the table over there. They usually have about 50 to 100 seeds in them, depending on the species, and you're not going to get a large quantity, but that's still a lot of plants, 50 to 100 plants. But you're going to get kind of, in New England, we just don't have the resources for large-scale seed dispersal across the landscape. Since we sell in small quantities and our seeds are hand-collected and hand-processed and packaged by volunteers and Wild Seed Project staff, we're a very small operation. We're growing our operation actually slowly. We just actually started partnering with a local land trust in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, to start a seed nursery where we'll be growing native plants in larger plots in order to collect seed a little bit more sustainably and get larger quantities. But we're still not going to be, Ernst Nursery from Pennsylvania, which sells large quantities of seed mixes and that you can kind of spread across the landscape. So because we sell small quantities, we encourage people to take those seeds and consider them precious. So don't just scatter them out in the field. You actually need to go through a process that's really straightforward, but planting them in pots or in a prepared bed to get the highest success for your seeds.
That actually was one of the next questions. If you could talk a little bit more about the cold stratification and what you need to do. I mean, I know you can't go to you could do a whole presentation probably just on that, but maybe just a little more detail about it.
Sure.
So for fall sowing of these native seeds.
Yeah. Fall and winter sowing of native seeds is a really fun topic, and actually that's what Wild Seed Project is concentrating this fall and winter. So there's going to be opportunities for online tutorials that will go into more depth and in-person kind of pop-up demonstrations of native seed sowing. But basically the steps to native seed sowing are You get the seeds, and if you get them at a different time of year from fall and winter, from mid-November through January, then you do need to store them in the refrigerator in a plastic bag so that they're airtight and they don't kind of germinate too early. Germinating means that they start sprouting. So you start by actually, you can do this inside. You bring in a pot with some organic rich potting soil packed into the pot, and you just sprinkle that whole packet of seeds into one little, like maybe a 4-inch pot. You can also use a yogurt container or a milk jug that's with the top cut off. Just make sure there's some drainage holes there. And then you need some all-purpose sand, some coarse sand, in order to sprinkle on top of the seeds and not have the seeds kind of float up. So we like to say you sprinkle the amount, the depth of the sand should be about the thickness of the seed. So for like a lupin seed, which is kind of like the size of a pea, 1/4 of an inch of sand is perfect. And for something like a blue lobelia seed, which is like a small piece of dust, just a really fine sprinkling of sand will do it. And then you put your flat of pots outside, and you want to make sure they're protected from rodents. Don't put them under the eave of anything. You want them to be exposed to the elements, get snowed on, rained on, etc., and go through freeze and thaw outside. You don't even need to water your plants in or your seeds in. You do put some kind of hardware fabric or hardware cloth on top of your pots, and you can weigh it down with like a brick or some rocks or something like that, just so the rodents don't get in and eat those seeds, like squirrels and chipmunks and things like that. And then come spring, your plants should start germinating. And this can take, it can be an early spring, like March, April, or even into May. And don't worry if they don't germinate even in May. Sometimes they come up a little bit later. This year my plants came up a little bit later because it was a really long, cool spring. And so some of them came up in mid-May. But they all did really well as long as they protected them from the squirrels, which would often eat them.
Okay, great. And I hope you don't mind my mentioning you, because you also mentioned Prairie Moon Nursery, and that's another great, I think also Prairie Nursery. Those are two good sources of seeds. And I do have some milkweed seeds from my garden, 3 different varieties that I'm well happy to give away to anyone who would like some here tonight. Okay, I don't want to do that. Sorry, Froland, that they must love hearing that at home. Someone asked, how do you assure that there aren't jumping worms if you're buying nursery plants? I don't know if that's really something, is that something you want to address?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's a tough question. Jumping worms are an invasive worm. Got a little feedback here, but it looks like it went away. That's good. Jumping worms are an invasive worm, an Asian species that have started to move throughout good portions of North America. They're in New England for sure. In Massachusetts, they are at Garden in the Woods, unfortunately. And they cause a lot of destruction to our soil structure. And that can have cascading effects in our ecosystem. So we want to minimize the spread of jumping worms. And first of all, you can go to your university extension and learn more, kind of find a fact sheet on jumping worms. But in order to stop the spread, you can first, when you buy potted plants from a nursery, before you plant them in the ground, I would take like a 5-gallon bucket and rinse all the soil off and just inspect it, make sure there's no worms in there. And then, plant that plant pretty quickly because it'll be bare rooted, and keep it moist until you have a chance to plant it. You can also get, growing things from seed. That's a really good reason to grow things from seed. And you can sometimes buy mail order bare root plants from places like Prairie Moon Nursery, which is a wonderful nursery in the Midwest. But buying locally is ideal so that the plants are adapted to our local climate and everything.
Someone asked when you had a slide that showed some very nicely placed leaves under a tree, and she said, how do you keep them from blowing away after you put them down? They just blow all over the yard.
Yeah. That's a good question about keeping leaves from blowing everywhere. How do you manage that? There's a blog post called Leave the Leaves on our website that you can search, and it's actually up on our homepage right now because it's very timely. So that actually goes into a lot of detail about different ways that you can consider managing leaves, because yeah, even when you're, taking the excess leaves from a certain spot and composting them, you're still going to have a lot of leaf blowing or movement in the fall and into the winter if they haven't been, compacted down by rain and snow. So one thing that I like to do is observe where the leaves do end up piling up over maybe the course of a growing season and plan accordingly. So in those kind of convex spaces and lower valleys or dells or against a fence, you're going to probably have more of the leaves kind of accumulate. And then on those little hills or knolls that are concave was what I was trying to say for the first one. In those convex places, those little hills or knolls where the leaves tend to kind of blow off and don't want to stay on, you can consider planting species that don't like to be kind of smothered by leaves. So that's might be where you have some of your grass species or your native ground covers or weaker stemmed plants. Well, in the kind of low spots where leaves tend to accumulate, you can put those more strong stemmed plants like bugbanes and blue cohosh and coneflowers, asters and goldenrods and things like that. But that takes time and it takes a lot of observation. So I would say that I try to leave a lot of my leaf cleanup to the spring, and you do have to kind of shift around and play with your management and your workload strategy, because there can be a lot of fall work and there can be a lot of spring work. And I know those are two times during the season when we're often stretched thin for time. I know I am a lot. And so I try to kind of do what I can and make those observations. And then just each year I adjust what I do based on what I'm noticing happening where the leaves tend to blow the most.
You talked about the importance of, if you have birdhouses out, that you need to keep them clean. And someone reiterated that in the chat. But then someone else asked about the bee houses. And do you clean those or do you replace those? Is that something you can clean?
Yeah, those bee houses or those bee hotels, you can easily clean out. A lot of them are filled with things like bamboo stakes and lots of little sticks and things like that. So you can take out that material and replace it with new material each year. Another nice kind of strategy for creating a bee house is to take a block of wood, a solid block of wood, that like a 2x4 or a 4x4, I mean, and just drill a variety of different size holes into it. And you can use, I think the smallest size holes get filled up the most. Usually the largest holes stay empty. So there's certain kinds of bee species that take up the smallest holes and the medium-sized holes. And then you can just compost that and start with a fresh one each year. That's another good strategy.
Any suggestions on the signs? Look great, but some of them are plastic. Any recommendations for non-plastic, something that's weatherproof that you could put up to let the neighbors know that you're doing the right thing?
Yeah, I think we've been kind of researching that a lot at Wild Seed Project because we're really devoted to, we've changed over our packing materials to be compostable, and we're working to, every time we have a new merch item, like our t-shirts, we want them to be made to the highest quality standards and our ethics. So I think for our signs, we've actually changed over to aluminum signs that are kind of coated. So at least they can be recycled when they do wear out and they don't tend to rust. And we have a current sign out that you saw. It's actually a kind of an updated version of the sign that you saw in the slide, and we're working on other types of signs. So you'll see over the next year or so more different types of signs kind of coming out on our website. So stay tuned, because we're having a lot of fun planning those signs.
And someone asked about fertilizing or providing peat moss for natives, amending the soil. Is it any different than anything else you're planting? Any special recommendations?
Yeah, my special recommendation is to not fertilize and not use peat moss if possible. So I know a lot of potting soils are actually mainly based in peat moss. And at Wild Seed Project, it's still a little bit of a struggle. We're still trying to find a good source for non-peat moss based potting soil. And we have a few leads, but we haven't made that changeover yet. So there are some different nurseries that try to kind of use non-peat based potting soils. And for fertilizers, our native plants don't need them. As long as we have living, healthy soils with a lot of organic matter in them, and we site the right plant for the right place, then your plants are gonna do well. If you plant a plant that needs a lot of nutrients and higher pH levels in our general acidic New England soils, then it might not thrive the way that it should. So I would stick to the plants in that work well for your soils and your light conditions. And then it just lessens the need for as much maintenance and as much additives and inputs into the soil.
And we had a question about a meadow that is lots of natives, but also lots of invasives. How do you go about getting rid of the stuff you don't want?
It's tricky. Meadows, I think, are probably the most tricky type of landscape to create because they're less managed, so you're going to have more invasive species and more weedy species, and pushing the balance towards native species can be a matter of skill and time and observation, and a lot of hard work. If you do have invasive species in your meadow, I recommend kind of starting from scratch. So you can put down a thick layer of black plastic, and sometimes you'll need to smother that for multiple years on end to make sure that you really have those invasive weeds dead. So you would want to cut those back, cut anything back to the ground, or pull anything out that you can, and then cover it with black plastic. And if you don't have invasive species in your meadow, but you do have some weedy species, that's a lot easier to manage. So I would suggest getting to know the species that are growing in your meadow. And when they start to flower, that's actually a really good time to identify them. Then you can cut them back when they're in flower before they have a chance to go to seed. You can go through with a string trimmer. I like the electric string trimmers because they're quiet and lightweight, and just target those non-native species that you don't want to encourage, and let the native species that you want to encourage keep reproducing and producing lots of seed. And then over time, it'll take sometimes years, you'll start to push the balance to be more heavily weighted towards native plants.
Just one more, and we got the answer to this question last week at the Garden Club. We had Dr. Jagir here, but we'll ask you the same question. Hummingbird feeders, is that okay, or should you rely on plants to feed the hummingbirds?
Another great question. Well, hummingbird feeders, in my mind, are a little bit like a similar situation to the bee hotels. They're great in terms of attracting a lot of those hummingbirds, but unless you're very vigilant about washing them out at least every 2 days and recleaning them, sterilizing them, and putting new feed back into them, then you could be doing more harm than good. So I do try to emphasize using the natural materials and what's out there in nature rather than something artificial like that too. I think the hummingbirds are going to get a lot more nutrients from a flower. The nectar in a flower doesn't just have sugar in it, it has a whole host of other nutritional value. So having lots of hummingbird attracting flowers in your yards at all different times of year is, in my mind, better than having a hummingbird feeder out. But if you're a real hummingbird person and you really want lots of hummingbirds, I'd say as long as you're vigilant with cleaning it out, you can put some bird feeders out. So it sounds like that was our last question. So thank you everyone so much for joining for the full hour and a half. And I hope to see you at another one in the future. Check out Wild Seed Project's website to see more of our upcoming events.